In 2008, you were led to believe that the bailout had cost only $700 billion. That, however, was a complete falsehood. In reality, the Federal Reserve covertly lent a staggering $16 trillion to Wall Street banks, foreign financial institutions, and hedge funds, concealing this massive transfer from the public for 3 years. It was only after Bloomberg sued that this hidden wealth was finally exposed. Among those who received these secret funds, Goldman Sachs alone obtained $600 billion, Morgan Stanley $2 trillion, Citigroup $2.5 trillion, and Bank of America received $1.3 trillion. Even a German bank, Deutsche Bank, was handed $354 billion of your money. Remarkably, not a single banker faced jail time or prosecution. Instead, they paid themselves millions in bonuses using these illicit funds, while ordinary Americans faced losing their homes, jobs, and retirement savings. Yet Wall Street executives grew richer than ever. For 3 years, the Federal Reserve, Congress, and the Treasury continued to lie about the true scale of these transactions. It was only when a lawsuit forced transparency in 2011 that the full story emerged. They hadn't lent $700 billion as claimed, but had secretly transferred $16 trillion, more than 23 times the official figure. The revelation revealed a more troubling fact. At the height of the crisis, the Federal Reserve had outstanding loans totaling over $7.7 trillion, more than half of the entire U.S. gross domestic product, lent in secret to not just American banks, but foreign institutions like Deutsche Bank, UBS in Switzerland, Barclays in Britain, and Credit Suisse in France. These foreign entities, along with American ones, received hundreds of billions of dollars backed by U.S. taxpayers, without anyone knowing. This scheme began to unfold after Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy on September 15, 2008, with $600 billion lost, marking the largest corporate failure in American history. The stock market crashed, credit markets froze, and panic ensued. In response, the government announced it had a plan, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, a purported $70 billion effort to stabilize the financial system by purchasing toxic assets from banks, supposedly protecting the economy. Congress debated this publicly, with widespread outrage over bailing out the very banks responsible for the crisis. Officials insisted there was no alternative. These institutions were too big to fail, meaning if they collapsed, the entire economy, including people's savings and jobs, would be destroyed. On October 3, 2008, Congress approved the $70 billion bailout, the largest in American history, as publicized. But beneath this narrative lay a stark reality. While Congress discussed the official sum, the Federal Reserve was secretly extending trillions of dollars through covert programs with obscure names you've never heard. Funds that were never disclosed to the public, Congress, or even the banks themselves. For 3 years, this secret lending remained hidden until Bloomberg sued to uncover the truth. After fighting in court for 2 years, in 2011, the data revealed an astonishing fact. The Fed's true lending totals were $16 trillion, 23 times larger than the officially reported figure. Moreover, these figures only represented the total accumulated over time. At the crisis's peak, the Federal Reserve had outstanding loans of over $7.7 trillion, more than 50% of the entire U.S. GDP, secretly lent to both domestic and foreign banks. Countries like Germany, Switzerland, Britain, and France's largest banks had received hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer-backed funds without any public disclosure. This vast covert operation, concealed for years behind the guise of legitimate monetary policy, was the greatest financial scheme in human history, a colossal transfer of wealth designed to benefit a privileged few while ordinary Americans paid the price. In 2008, the official story was that a bailout of $700 billion was necessary to prevent the collapse of the financial system. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, who had previously been CEO of Goldman Sachs, appeared before Congress and insisted that this sum was required to purchase toxic mortgage-backed securities from banks, with the goal of cleaning up their shaky balance sheets and stabilizing the economy. Public outrage grew, questioning why taxpayers should be forced to rescue Wall Street's reckless practices. Yet Paulson, along with Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, claimed that there was no alternative. and so Congress authorized the emergency measure on October 3rd. This widely publicized $700 billion figure became the accepted narrative. However, what was never openly revealed is that this amount wasn't the full story. The $700 billion figure served primarily as a distraction, a smokescreen. While eyes remained fixed on the public debate over that sum, the Federal Reserve was secretly operating an array of undisclosed programs with bureaucratic-sounding names like the Primary Dealer Credit Facility, the Term Securities Lending Facility, and the Asset-Backed Commercial Paper Money Market Liquidity Facility. These labels were intentionally dull to prevent scrutiny. Through these covert channels, the Fed lent trillions of dollars, vast sums, entirely in secrecy. There was no congressional approval, no public debate, and zero transparency involved. The Federal Reserve simply created money out of thin air and loaned it to banks. They didn't even have to disclose when borrowing occurred. It was all done secretly, without the knowledge of the public, Congress, or even the bank's own shareholders. No one knew who else was borrowing, and nobody had a clue about the true scope of these complex operations. The Fed's primary tool for emergency lending was the discount window, a facility designed to provide short-term cash infusions to banks facing liquidity shortages. Banks could use it by offering collateral, borrowing overnight, and repaying with a modest interest. It was meant as a last resort, kept confidential to prevent bank runs or panic. Yet in 2008, the Fed went far beyond this narrow use. They fashioned entirely new, large-scale lending programs that extended funds to not only commercial banks, but also investment banks, hedge funds, foreign banks, and large corporations, any entity Wall Street deemed worthy, without any public oversight. These loans reached hundreds of billions, sometimes over $1 trillion, to individual institutions for extended periods. What's more, the banks were under no obligation to inform shareholders or the public about these borrowings. The entire process was shrouded in secrecy, structured so that nobody knew how much was being lent, to whom, or on what terms. This opaque system persisted for years. The Fed operated under the guise of the discount window, but had created a multitude of clandestine lending facilities that bypassed any accountability. The loans were enormous, and they were kept hidden, banking secrecy as a strategic tool. When Bloomberg News finally decided to challenge this cloak of opacity, they filed a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit on November 7, 2008, demanding transparency about who was receiving these enormous sums and under what collateral. The outcome of that legal battle would ultimately reveal that the true scale of the Federal Reserve's secret lending operations was unprecedented, an undisclosed total that reached into the trillions. They sought transparency, wanting to know exactly who was receiving bailout funds, how much they were given, and what collateral they had pledged, basic details to understand the scope of aid. Yet, the Federal Reserve refused to comply, claiming that disclosure would compromise confidential trade secrets. They argued that revealing such information could damage the bank's competitive positions and feared it might incite panic among investors and the public. This resistance persisted for 2 years, with Bloomberg News fervently fighting in court to obtain transparency. Despite their efforts, the Fed lost every legal challenge, including a court ruling in 2010 that mandated the disclosure of the data. When the Fed appealed again and faced defeat, they finally released the records in 2011. What the data revealed was astonishing. From 2007 to 2010, the Federal Reserve had extended an estimated total of $16.1 trillion in loans to banks and corporations, significantly more than the publicly admitted figure of just $700 billion. At the height of the crisis in late 2008, the Fed's outstanding loans peaked at a staggering $777 trillion, a figure that dwarfed the total U.S. federal budget for that year, which was approximately $2.9 trillion. To put this into perspective, the entire gross domestic product of the United States in 2008 was roughly $14.7 trillion. The Fed's secret loans to banks surpassed half of that GDP. This was not merely a bailout. It was the largest transfer of wealth in human history, executed in secrecy for over 3 years. The released data comprised 21,000 transactions, accompanied by thousands of pages of records. Expert researchers meticulously reviewed these documents and found that some of the most prominent recipients had borrowed astronomical sums. Citigroup alone borrowed $2.5 trillion. Morgan Stanley borrowed a similar amount, about $2.04 trillion. Merrill Lynch, which was eventually acquired by Bank of America, borrowed approximately $1.9 trillion, with Bank of America itself receiving about $1.3 trillion. British banking giant Barclays received around $868 billion. Bear Stearns took in approximately $853 billion. Goldman Sachs secured roughly $814 billion, and the Royal Bank of Scotland, based in Britain, was granted around $541 billion. JP Morgan Chase borrowed approximately $391 billion, while Deutsche Bank, based in Germany, obtained about $354 billion. Other foreign institutions like UBS in Switzerland and Credit Suisse also received hundreds of billions, about $287 billion and $162 billion respectively. Even before their collapse, Lehman Brothers received roughly $183 billion in loans. These figures, representing cumulative totals across multiple transactions, underscore the scale of illicit aid. The amount borrowed by Citigroup, for instance, was more than 3 times the entire publicly debated TARP program of $700 billion. Such revelations came from official government audits, confirmed, not conspiratorial. The Federal Reserve was forced to release these figures after losing multiple court battles, exposing an undisclosed, massive flow of dollars. This secret financial aid wasn't limited to American institutions. The foreign banks, which 9 should have been outraged, received their share, funds that contributed to the crisis's depth. Deutsche Bank, a German bank infamous for past scandals involving financial manipulation, received $354 billion. UBS, a Swiss bank, received $187 billion. Credit Suisse, also Swiss, secured more than $162 billion. British banks like Barclays and the Royal Bank of Scotland received, respectively, around $868 billion and over $541 billion. This clandestine network of astonishingly large borrowings was carried out entirely in secret, without congressional approval or public knowledge. The loans had been made at near-zero interest rates. The discount rate in late 2008 was merely half a percentage point. Such ultra-cheap financing allowed banks to borrow enormous sums and invest in risk-free assets like treasury bonds, which paid 3 to 4%, guaranteed profits with no exposure, leaving taxpayers holding the potential losses if the collateral's value plummeted. In sum, the true scope of the Federal Reserve's intervention during the financial crisis was hidden from the public for years. Instead of a straightforward bailout, what occurred was an unprecedented transfer of trillions of dollars, much of it secretly lent and largely unaccounted for, benefiting a handful of powerful financial institutions around the globe, with devastating consequences for ordinary Americans. In addition to U.S. banks, foreign financial institutions also benefited enormously from the Federal Reserve's secret loans during the crisis. For example, a Belgian bank called Dexia received a staggering total of $120 billion, and another Belgian bank, Dexia, obtained an additional $159 billion. These figures represent loans to foreign banks, not American ones. Yet, the U.S. Federal Reserve lent them hundreds of billions of dollars, despite not having direct operations in the United States. The reason was that these foreign banks had established subsidiaries within U.S. borders, making them integral parts of the global financial network. As the crisis unfolded, they desperately needed large amounts of dollars, which their own central banks were unable to supply because their toxic assets were denominated in dollars. To address this, the Federal Reserve stepped in, providing the necessary liquidity, backed by U.S. taxpayers' funds, without obtaining any congressional approval or informing the public. Deutsche Bank, a German institution that had previously been fined billions for manipulating the LIBOR rate, money laundering, and fraud, received an astonishing $354 billion in secret loans from the Federal. Meanwhile, the public remained unaware. Congress had no knowledge. The American taxpayer was unknowingly footing the bill to bail out banks from Germany, Switzerland, Britain, and France. It was only in 2011, 3 years after the fact, that these details emerged. Now, examining the nature of these loans reveals the extent of corruption involved. The Federal Reserve wasn't simply lending at typical market rates. Instead, They provided funds at almost zero interest. By late 2008, the discount rate, the rate at which banks could borrow directly from the Fed, was just 0.5%, half a percent. This meant banks could borrow billions of dollars at an incredibly low rate. But what was the bank's strategy with all that money? They bought treasury bonds offering around 3% interest, creating an instant profit with virtually no risk. Essentially, they borrowed at 0.5%, invested in safe treasuries paying 3%, and pocketed the difference, a strategy known as the carry trade. This enabled banks to make billions while the legitimacy of their gains was obscured, and all using money supplied by the Fed. At the same time, homeowners were struggling with foreclosure crises, facing mortgage rates as high as 6 to 7%. The very banks responsible for causing the crisis by issuing irresponsible loans were now profiting from nearly free money, and they retained all the profits, paying themselves lavish bonuses, rewarding shareholders, and buying back their own stock. Meanwhile, nowhere in this scheme did funds go toward helping homeowners or supporting small businesses. Instead, the funds directly enriched Wall Street insiders. The Fed claimed these loans weren't gifts, but were collateral-backed loans. The idea was that if banks defaulted, the Fed could seize their collateral, ostensibly protecting taxpayers from losses. However, the collateral was often worthless mortgage-backed securities, same toxic assets that fueled the crisis, valued at perhaps 30 or 40 cents on the dollar. Yet, the Fed accepted these securities at face value, lending vast amounts against them. For instance, a mortgage-backed security worth $30 million in the open market could be used as collateral to borrow $100 million, an over-collateralization heavily in the bank's favor. The Fed didn't mark assets to market. They simply accepted whatever value the banks claimed. This meant banks could unload their worst assets, get full value in cash from the Fed, and if those assets lost all value, the loss was absorbed by taxpayers, that is, by you. Far from being straightforward loans, these transactions resembled money laundering schemes. When journalists Bloomberg and government auditors in the GAO asked what happened to the collateral, the Fed refused to disclose details, claiming confidentiality. The true extent of taxpayer losses on these toxic assets remains unknown to this day. While Wall Street was secretly extracting trillions of dollars through hidden loans at near-zero interest rates, the government's efforts to assist homeowners suffering from the aftermath of the crisis were negligible. In 2010, nearly 4 million families faced foreclosure, losing their homes and salvaged life savings in the process. Many of these homeowners had bought properties with predatory loans, inflated appraisals, and promises they could afford payments on, but ultimately found themselves homeless. In response, a program called the Home Affordable Modification Program was launched, supposedly designed to help distressed homeowners modify their mortgages and avoid foreclosure. However, in reality, it was a farcical effort. Homeowners were required to apply, submit extensive documentation, and then wait months for a decision, most of whom were denied. Out of the $75 billion allocated for the program, only $25 billion was actually spent. Of the 4 million families the program was supposed to help, merely 1,300,000 received permanent mortgage modifications. Meanwhile, the banks derived immense profits from secret loans, totaling trillions, which were given at nearly zero interest rates and backed by worthless collateral. As a result, when individuals lost their jobs during the recession caused by Wall Street's recklessness, they couldn't pay their mortgages. Banks responded by foreclosing on their homes, selling them at a loss, and evicting families, all while the banks themselves had been secretly bailed out by the Federal Reserve using taxpayer funds. These bailouts were hidden from the public, and millions were left homeless. That is the true story of the 2008 bailout. Turning to justice, one might expect that such widespread fraud, misrepresentation, or money laundering by banks would lead to criminal prosecutions. But in reality, not a single major Wall Street executive faced jail time for causing the crisis. The FBI, which had employed around 1,000 agents investigating mortgage fraud in 2007, had most of those agents reassigned to counterterrorism the following year. Under the Obama administration, the Department of Justice decided against pursuing significant criminal charges, with Attorney General Eric Holder explicitly stating that prosecuting large banks could destabilize the entire financial system. Instead, Banks were subjected to fines, billions of dollars, but these served more as costs of doing business rather than accountability. For instance, Goldman Sachs paid $5 billion to settle fraud charges, an amount insignificant compared to their $100 billion in annual revenue, a mere 5% of their earnings. The fines were paid by shareholders, not by the executives responsible for the fraud. While senior bank leaders like Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein amassed fortunes, Dimon earning $20 million in 2008, Blankfein $54 million in 2007, and Moynihan $8 million in 2010. The rest of the population faced economic hardship. No bank executives went to jail, and justice remained absent from the aftermath of the crisis. Let's consider the issue of bonuses, which starkly reveals the true nature of the 2008 crisis as nothing more than a well-orchestrated scam. At the height of the financial turmoil in 2008, banks were collapsing under the weight of bad bets, in the process of being rescued through monumental bailouts, while secretly borrowing trillions of dollars from the Federal Reserve. Yet, amidst this chaos, what do you think they did with the massive sums they obtained? They handed out billions in bonuses to their employees. To put this into perspective, Wall Street paid out a staggering $18.4 billion in bonuses that year, billion with a B, during the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Remarkably, banks that were secretly borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars from the Fed, in some cases, billions at a time, still managed to reward their staff with enormous payouts. For instance, Morgan Stanley borrowed $107 billion from the Fed in only 1 month, October of 2008. In that very quarter, they paid out $6.4 billion in compensation. Goldman Sachs, in October, borrowed $69 billion from the Fed and paid a total of $10.9 billion in compensation for the entire year, including nearly $5 billion in bonuses. Likewise, Citigroup, which had accumulated a total borrowing of $2.5 trillion, handed out an astonishing $5.3 billion in bonuses in just that year, all while taking taxpayer money and rewarding themselves with it. How is this possible? The Federal Reserve is not an arm of the federal government, but a quasi-private institution owned by member banks, operating independently of political control. Its loaning powers don't require approval from Congress. Instead, the Fed can create money out of thin air and lend it under emergency provisions, specifically Section 133 of the Federal Reserve Act, which allows lending in circumstances deemed unusual and exigent. The key question becomes, who decides what qualifies as unusual or exigent? The Fed itself. So, in 2008, declaring an emergency, the Federal Reserve launched trillions of dollars in secret loans without informing Congress or the public, claiming these operations were confidential. The facilities established for this purpose, such as the discount window and other emergency lending programs, were shrouded in secrecy. Banks were not required to report their borrowing in financial statements or disclose it to shareholders or investors. The entire public was kept in the dark. This arrangement was the perfect scam. Money was created and handed over to banks in secret, away from scrutiny, with no oversight. They could have kept this going indefinitely had it not been for Bloomberg News's persistent legal efforts. The news organization filed a lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act, fighting for nearly 2 years in court before the courts finally ordered the Fed in 2011 to release the details. When the data was finally disclosed, the scale of the operation was staggering. The Federal Reserve had extended a total of $16.1 trillion in loans to banks and corporations from 2007 to 2010, far beyond the publicly announced $700 billion bailout. At its peak in late 2008, outstanding loans from the Fed reached a mind-boggling $777 trillion, more than half the entire gross domestic product of the United States in that year, which was just under $14.7 trillion. Worse still, these figures covered only the loans over time. The actual amount borrowed at the crisis's height was hundreds of billions of dollars, in secret, with the full extent concealed from everyone. Even more disturbing was the fact that foreign banks received enormous sums secretly from the federal German Deutsche Bank received $354 billion. Swiss banks UBS and Credit Suisse received $187 billion and $162 billion, respectively. British banks Barclays and Royal Bank of Scotland secured $868 billion and $541 billion. These were not American banks. These were foreign institutions connected to the global financial system that obtained trillions of dollars backed by U.S. taxpayers' money, without their government's approval and without the public knowing. These secretly obtained funds were used to prop up foreign operations and cover their risks, further illustrating the extent of the covert bailout. The terms of these loans further exposed the depth of the corruption. The Federal Reserve did not lend at market rates, but offered nearly zero-interest loans, at about 0.5%, making it incredibly profitable for banks to borrow. With such cheap money, banks could buy safe and lucrative assets like U.S. Treasury bonds and instantly turn a profit. This strategy is known as the carry trade, borrowing cheaply and investing in higher-yield securities, pocketing the difference. Meanwhile, homeowners struggling with high mortgage rates faced foreclosures, with millions losing their homes, while the very banks responsible for creating and peddling toxic mortgages used taxpayer-funded cheap loans to make billions in profits, paying bonuses and dividends without a hint of remorse or accountability. The collateral backing these loans was no more than toxic mortgage-backed securities, assets often worth only a fraction of their face value, yet the Fed accepted them at face value, over-collateralizing the loans. These assets, riddled with fraudulent valuations, could have collapsed entirely, leaving taxpayers holding the bag for massive losses. The Fed refused to disclose data on collateral, claiming confidentiality, which meant the public remains in the dark about how much of this toxic garbage was ultimately written off as a loss. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans faced an entirely different reality. While banks reaped hundreds of billions of dollars in secret loans and bonuses, millions of families lost their homes during the foreclosure crisis. The Home Affordable Modification Program, a government scheme ostensibly designed to help homeowners, was a sham. Out of $75 billion allocated, only a fraction was spent, and just 3 million of the 4 million homeowners slated to have benefits received permanent modifications. Instead of aid, families were evicted, their savings wiped out, and their lives shattered. Most infuriating of all, not a single major banking executive was prosecuted or held accountable for the crimes linked to the crisis. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had thousands of agents investigating mortgage fraud in 2007, but shifted focus to counterterrorism, and the Department of Justice under President Obama decided that prosecuting Wall Street giants would destabilize the financial system. As a result, no top executives faced criminal charges, and fines, like Goldman Sachs' $5 billion settlement, were mere chump change compared to their billions in profits. Bonuses continued to pour out in record amounts, with top bankers earning tens of millions annually, even as ordinary Americans faced foreclosure, unemployment, and poverty. This scandal reveals that the entire crisis was a carefully orchestrated scheme, designed not to save the economy, but to save Wall Street. The big banks leveraged up to 30 and 40 times their capital, engaging in reckless bets, selling toxic securities, and betting against their own clients, covered by the government's lifeline. The regulators, mainly ex-Wall Street insiders, predominantly protected their friends, ensuring the system remained rigged. When the dust settled, the banks were more powerful and more concentrated than ever, controlling over 47% of all U.S. banking assets, a figure that has increased since 2008, despite grand promises that the crisis would lead to reforms. Most disturbingly, the lessons of 2008 were ignored. It exposed a system fundamentally rigged for the bankers' benefit, privatizing gains while socializing losses. And now, with the financial reform law known as Dodd-Frank, mechanisms were introduced, bail-ins, that could make depositors directly responsible for bank failures. That means your savings, in many instances, could be seized and converted into bank stock to keep the failed institutions afloat, further demonstrating how the entire system continues to serve the interests of the financial elite at the expense of ordinary people. This entire scandal underscores the undeniable fact: the so-called bailout was, in reality, a massive transfer of wealth, hidden, unaccounted for, and utterly unjust. Yet most Americans remained unaware until it was too late. For decades, they strategically embedded themselves within government institutions. In 2008, Hank Paulson, a former Goldman Sachs CEO, served as Treasury Secretary. His successor, Timothy Geithner, previously led the New York Federal Reserve and maintained close ties to Wall Street. Meanwhile, Ben Bernanke, the Federal Reserve Chairman, was known for advocating aggressive intervention by central banks. These weren't impartial regulators, but insiders with deep connections to financial powerhouses. When the crisis struck, they prioritized protecting their friends and allies in finance. Rather than relying solely on the publicly announced $70 billion bailout, often called the TARP, they orchestrated a series of clandestine loans amounting to trillions of dollars, hidden from public view until it was too late. This covert operation proved effective. By the year 2011, when the secret data eventually emerged, the banks had regained profitability, stock prices soared, and corporate executives became substantially richer. Official narratives claimed that the bailouts had stabilized the system, saving the economy. But this was a deception. The system itself had not been truly saved. It had only been propped up temporarily. There's a crucial distinction between rescuing a system and simply bailing out its institutions. What many are unaware of is that the once too big to fail banks of 2008 are now even larger. In that year, the 5 largest banks held control over roughly 40% of U.S. banking assets. Today, their share has increased to almost 50%. These institutions, more concentrated, more dominant, and unequivocally too big to fail, have grown significantly. J.P. Morgan Chase now possesses about $3.2 trillion in assets. Bank of America boasts $2.5 trillion. Wells Fargo manages $1.9 trillion. Citigroup, approximately $1.8 trillion, and Goldman Sachs, around $1.5 trillion. These are the same banks that nearly collapsed in 2008. And yet, thanks to the bailouts, they have become even stronger. Meanwhile, smaller banks have struggled and often been absorbed by larger institutions. The megabanks have expanded, their dominance reinforced. With each subsequent crisis, it's inevitable that even greater bailouts will be necessary. The leverage held by these banks has increased, along with the risks they pose to the entire financial system. They are confident they will be rescued again because they've been rescued before. This pattern fosters a dangerous moral hazard. When you rescue anyone from the fallout of their reckless or fraudulent decisions, it incentivizes even worse behavior next time. Wall Street has learned that regardless of how reckless or corrupt their actions, the government will step in to shield them. This cycle of dependence has profound implications. If a future crisis occurs, the bailout may no longer require the Federal Reserve. Thanks to the 2010 passage of the Dodd-Frank Act, a provision known as bail-ins was embedded into financial regulation. Instead of taxpayer-funded rescue operations, depositors' savings could be used to stabilize failing banks, effectively turning their deposits into bank equity. In 2013, Cyprus exemplified this process. Deposits over $100,000 in failing banks were seized and converted into shares, resulting in depositors losing almost half their money overnight. Legally, this practice is permitted under the United States Resolution Authority, managed by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. In a rescue, the FDIC can take control of a failing bank and restructure it. And part of that process is a bail-in, converting depositors' savings into bank shares. This means that your savings could be legally taken, rebranded as a bail-in, if the banks face collapse in the future. However, it all amounts to the same scheme. Your money is used to rescue the banks, just as your tax dollars were drained in 2008. This time, though, the process will be even more direct. You might find your own account seized to save a failing bank. What lessons should we take from this? First, the official story of the 2008 bailout was a deception. You were told the cost was $700 billion, but the true figure exceeded $16 trillion. The narrative claimed the rescue was about stabilizing the economy, but in reality, it was primarily about saving Wall Street. Public assurances suggested taxpayers would be reimbursed, yet the banks borrowed near-zero interest rates and amassed billions in profits. The story was that the crisis was temporary. Now, the banks have grown larger than ever before. Promises of accountability proved hollow. No one was prosecuted. We were told such a catastrophe wouldn't happen again, but history shows it will. In future crises, your deposits could be the next target, absorbed directly to bail out banks. The Federal Reserve, the Treasury, Congress, and Wall Street all lied systematically. For 3 years, hidden behind closed doors, they lent out $16 trillion secretly, even aiding foreign banks with your money. Meanwhile, bank executives paid themselves billions in bonuses, and the prospect of jail remained non-existent. This, without doubt, ranks as the greatest theft in human history, and they succeeded in covering it up. By the time the public became aware, the money was gone, and the banks were secured. Now, preparations are underway for the next collapse, with the same methods ready to be deployed again. If this information has opened your eyes to what truly transpired in 2008, understand that staying informed is crucial. When the next crisis arrives and discussions of bailouts resume, you'll want to know what's really happening, beyond the deceptive narratives broadcast on TV. Instead of another misleading story about $700 billion, you need to be aware of the trillions secretly funneled through undisclosed programs, hidden in fine print. They carried out these schemes before, and history indicates they will do so again. And I will provide you with the evidence, solid receipts, to prove it.